We are back with another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. We got some mailbag questions to go over, and I extended it from Friday, so we still got a couple to get into, and we're going to carry that into our second segment. And lastly, I've got some thoughts on what the outcome could mean for this American League Divisional Series in the playoffs. That's all coming up next on Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
As we said, we are back with another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network, and I am your host, Jack Johnson. Now, you can catch all these podcasting episodes on wherever you get your podcast. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast, or you can find us on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. Also, be sure to leave a review when you're following along on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. There's always the ability to rate an episode. Let us know your thoughts. We want to make this podcast as good as it possibly can be. The only way we can do that is if it comes from you, the listener, you, the fan. So we'd really appreciate it if we can get as much feedback as we can. Now, I know in the last couple weeks or so, we haven't been as consistent with the times in which these podcast episodes come out on. I apologize for that. I'm trying to shoot for Monday through Friday, usually around the same time. But sometimes with my work schedule, got to work around it a little bit. So just bear with me. Even if we miss an episode like we did on Friday, always are going to try to get one out before the end of the weekend. Now, I know for today, kind of coming up on time a little bit, but hopefully whenever you watch this, it won't be too late for you or too early for you in the morning. Now, this is your first ever episode listening for Locked On Royals. I'm just a lifelong Royals fan, as I'm sure you are. You want to get some offseason content. You want to know about the season. You want to know about certain breaking news stuff. Just come to this podcasting outlet here. Well, we have a lot of fun here. You know, I'm a diehard Royals fan, as I said, just like you. And I work here in Kansas City at Sports Radio 810 WHB. So my life is sports, basically. I cover the Royals for a living. I cover the Chiefs. I cover local college teams. I mean, it consumes a lot of my life. But I always say that baseball has a special place in my heart. And I always want to put baseball ahead of everything else, it feels like, because this is a team that, you know, I grew fond of from a very young age and have continued to enjoy watching them play every single day during the season. And now we've entered the offseason. And with the offseason, well, that breeds new ideas. We want to have more guests on this show. We want to have more content ideas. And we're hoping that this long layoff here, half a year, basically 6 months, before you can really see the Royals back in action. At least that should be about right for the regular season. We hope we bring you really good content and content that will make you share this podcast, will make you want to stay, because that's important to me. When I took over this podcasting platform, I wanted to be somebody that could grow this into a really big thing. And so far, we've done a really good job with that on all of our platforms, whether that be podcasting platforms or on YouTube or on social media. We've done a great job with that, and I can't thank you enough, the listeners and the fans out there. But let's, move on with this, right? Let's get into what I was not able to give you on Friday, which was our weekly Mailbag Friday. And we're going to continue doing that throughout the offseason. And no, it might not be as loaded as it was in the regular season, but anytime you have a question, I will get to it. I will give you a shout out on this podcast. So let's go to Twitter and see what we got over the weekend, because I wanted to extend it just to give some people some more time to send those questions. And I didn't want to cut anybody short. And we only had about one or two on Friday. So I thought, why not extend it into this weekend, give some people more time to see the tweet and send some questions my way. So this came from Ben on Twitter. Realistic 2024 predictions. It's a pretty broad question, but I think it's a very good question. So I really do appreciate the input, Ben. A lot of people are going to go into this offseason and wonder, how much better can this team really get? And was the second half a fluke? Was it the Royals of old that are out of it by May, but once it gets meaningless in, what would it be, August, maybe late July, September, early September, they just start playing better because nobody's at the games. Maybe you're playing other teams that are checked out. I mean, that's happened before. We've seen some bad Royals teams play well in the second half, play well in September, and then you flip the calendar year, and it's back to the same old, same old. To answer your question, Ben, a lot of this is going to come down to how serious the Royals are about adding pieces to this team, because a lot of it is going to be dependent on free agency. If the Royals go out and overhaul their bullpen, let's say they go out there and spend roughly $10 million on their bullpen between 4 to 5 guys. I mean, really revamp the bullpen, which I'm hoping they do. Now, you can keep James McCarthy, you can keep Carlos Hernandez, but having some outside names and some consistent names and some big-time big leaguers in that bullpen, that's going to change the direction of this team, because the bullpen blew a lot of games last year, and they basically ran out of arms. My realistic prediction, if they can revamp that bullpen and add at least one guy to the rotation, you're looking at about a 75-win team. That may not be exciting to you. I think we can see a much better offense with Bobby Witt Jr., Vinny Pasquantino, Michael Garcia leading the way. You're hoping that MJ Melendez, the second half version of MJ Melendez and not the first half. You hope that guys like Kyle Isbell and Michael Massey can take a step forward. You hope Nelson Velasquez is the real deal. Cole Reagan's going to become your true number one. But you need some stability. And if the Royals get stability, I don't think there's much stopping them from improving their win total by, what would that be? 30 games? No, that's way too high. That would be 19 maybe? Is that 19 games? Yeah, I think it'd be 19 games. If they get to 75 wins, that would be 19 games. Now, JJ Picollo said he wants to get into the 80 to 85 win territory. Well, if you mean that, it's going to take more than just a couple of bullpen signings and maybe one arm to the rotation and corner outfield bat. You really have to improve this team if you expect to get there by 29 to 30 games. Now, 19, that feels more doable. Like we discussed in the podcast on Thursday, you follow the Arizona Diamondbacks rebuild plan. They lost 110 in 2021, and they won 74 games in 2022. Then, of course, this year, here they are, up 1-0 in the National League Divisional Series against the Dodgers team that won 100 games. My realistic prediction, I think this team can win about 74, 75 with a couple of bullpen signings. I think that Phil Maton is one of my favorite guys in that class. Joe Jimenez, we discussed this last week. Ryan Stanek, another guy that I really like. Matt Moore would be very affordable. There are going to be guys the Royals can go out there and spend money on. Just a matter of what that player wants at this point in their career. Do they want to go to Kansas City in a one-year deal where that team's likely not competing for a postseason spot, or do they want to go somewhere for less money where they know they're going to be pitching in October? I guess we'll have to wait and see to find that out. The next question we have here, probably the last one we'll answer in the first segment, then go to break and come back with some more questions for our mailbag. This comes from Luke. What can a fan expect to see out of the Royals next year? So kind of along the lines of what Ben is asking of realistic 2024 predictions, I think you will see kind of a similar version of the 2021 Royals, and one that might be able to hang around for a little bit longer than we expect. But in the end, I think pitching will be the downfall. I don't think they're going to have enough depth. I think we can see a team that is far more equipped to contend in the AL Central. I mean, you can build around a Bobby Witt Jr., Garcia, and Pasquantino in your lineup. That's going to go a long ways. I mean, the first 4 hitters in this lineup, they can do some serious damage. Then you're piecing it together with Nelson Velasquez, Michael Massey, maybe a Freddie Fermin, a Drew Waters. Maybe you do add a bat or two through free agency or through trade. MJ Melendez too, throw him in there. I mean, I like the first 5 guys in the lineup. Does it mean they're going to all click at the same time? No. But I would say that we should expect a team that is far more consistent, not out of it by April. And I think a front office that is going to start looking for guys in the right places. Maybe that's too broad of an answer, and I do apologize for that. But to answer your question, Luke, as best as I can, I think we see a team that from start to finish is far more enjoyable to watch, far more competitive. I think better coached, have far more talent. This was truly an evaluation year in which they knew they were going to lose a lot of games. I mean, I read a fantastic article on The Athletic about Brandon Hyde and the Orioles, who we'll talk about later on in the show. But Brandon Hyde knew going and taking that Orioles job, it was going to be bad. It was going to be bad for quite some time, and he stuck with it, and look where they're at now. 100-game winner, yes, on the brink of elimination, but nobody thought Baltimore would be here at this point. For Kansas City, you hope people are saying the same thing about you here in maybe 2 years, 3 years. Don't really know the exact timeline, but that would be my best guess at this point. Okay, we are going to answer some more questions when we come back here. Wanted to split this up because we got more to go into, so that's coming up on Locked On Royals. You are tuning to Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. You can follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. And you can catch all these podcasting episodes on wherever you get your podcasting episodes. And that can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast, and on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. We got more questions to get into here, so let's not waste any time and get as many as we can in this 10 or so minute segment. The next one we got here comes from Thomas. He asked, will Brady Singer stay in the rotation or become a reliever? I still think he would be served better as a starter. This was one I have gotten probably 5 to 6 times, and more so came at the tail end of the season. Brady Singer is a starter. Let's get that very, very cemented in here, I guess, for lack of a better term. Let's lock that in. Brady Singer is a starter for this Kansas City team. Could he be a reliever in the future? Sure. It can't be in Kansas City. That's just the reality of the situation. If the Royals were entering a year like 2015, where you've added a few pieces, the bullpen's already really good, and you're expecting to compete for an American League crown, then maybe we can make that decision. Reality is, the Royals are not. The Royals need pitching. They need somebody in the rotation to give them innings. We just heard J.J. Piccolo say they expect Jordan Lyles to be back in the rotation. I don't think it stays that way, but that tells me they need arms right now. They don't have a lot of guys they can trust to get outs. And at least, compared to some of the options that we could go with in the rotation, Brady Singer's had a very good year at a big league level. Can't say the same for Daniel Lynch. Can't say the same for Chris Bubich. Can't say the same for Alec Marsh. Can't say the same for Jonathan Bolin, Anthony Veneziano. It can't even say the same for Jordan Lyles. You're going to be losing Zach Greinke likely. So Cole Reagan's the only guy you feel really good about. I like, Thomas, how you went back and said, I think he serves better as a starter, because I agree. I don't think that Brady Singer gets much better in the bullpen. That's just my personal opinion. I don't think we see a massive improvement. It reminds me a lot of when the Royals tried to move Jake Junis to the bullpen. Now, I'm not going to be talking down to people here. I'm not going to put myself up on a pedestal, because I did believe that Jake Junis' stuff could play in the bullpen. He had the wipeout slider, the big swing and miss slider, but at that point in time, the Royals didn't need to move Jake Junis to the bullpen. He needed to be a starter because they need guys to give them innings. What good does a good reliever do you if you don't have a good rotation? You're not closing out any games. You're not holding on to any leads because none of these starters can hand it off to you in the 6th or the 7th with something to work with. If the Royals had 3 or 4 guys added in the offseason, if they wouldn't have made a trade and you have 3 solid guys in the rotation and you have Cole Reagans, well, I don't think that number 5 spot would be necessarily handed to Brady Singer, but it's either him or Alec Marsh or Chris Bubich or Daniel Lynch. Who do you want there? I would go with more of the consistent guy who's at least shown one time at the big league level he's done it. he's had a very good year. That's what I'm going off of. So for my answer, I'm going to agree with you, Thomas. I don't think there's a need to put him in the bullpen until this team gets a lot better and he's a lot worse. That's when I think you can make that decision. The Royals moved Wade Davis to the bullpen because they were a much more competitive team. They couldn't wait around to see if Wade Davis could stick in the rotation. They had guys to replace him. They had Jordano Ventura to replace him. They had Vargas. They had Shields. They had guys. And this team doesn't have enough guys in the rotation and can afford to move Brady Singer to the bullpen. Just not yet would be my best answer. And then we got this question from Devin, and I actually had to respond to this on Twitter of, how am I doing? I've been reporting on this garbage heap for a while. Forget about the Royals for 2 seconds. How are you doing? I think it's funny because I really did have an enjoyable time watching this team and watching this team from start to finish. Call me crazy. Call me psychotic. I get it. But baseball is baseball to me. I'm always going to love baseball. That's not really going to sway me off my path. If the team loses 106 games, I enjoy watching baseball, whether it's the Royals or it's postseason baseball. I just enjoy it. I will say this, though, and I said this on Twitter. I lived through some really bad years of Royals baseball, as I'm sure some of you listening did the same. You remember those ugly years in the early 2000s. Some of you remember some bad years in the 90s. Not so much in the 80s, of course, because they were the best they'd ever been, really. But you lived through some ugly years, and that, for some reason, prepared me for years like this. Even the last couple years prepared me for something like this. 18 and 19 were unwatchable. I had less fun watching those teams who won more games than this team by a mile. I had no enjoyment watching the 18 and 19 teams. I didn't have much enjoyment watching the 2022 team. This team, maybe it was Bobby Witt Jr.'s stardom, it was Cole Reagan's, it was Garcia. Maybe it was that. But honestly, this season didn't sting me as bad. It sucked to watch all the losses pile up. But I've just seen a lot of bad baseball in my lifetime that become numb to it. I just do. I become numb to it a little bit. Maybe that says more about me than the Royals, or maybe more so about me than the average fan. But I'm doing just fine. I love doing this podcast. I love talking Royals, even if they aren't the ones playing in the postseason right now. I'm hoping one day they can get back to that, and we could have much more invigorating and positive shows than maybe the one we're having today. And lastly, Lando on Twitter asks, how quick do you think the big names of the 2023 Royals draft class, Blake Mitchell, Carson Roccaforte, you have Hunter Owen, and Werner as well, can move through the system? Trevor Werner, of course, the product out of Texas A&M. A couple of those guys are college bats. Blake Mitchell's going to take some time. I think Blake Mitchell we wouldn't see till 2026 would be my guess. That's kind of my target line at this point. Could be 2025 if he really progresses in year one. As for Roccaforte, as for Jared Dickey, Spencer Nivens, Hunter Owen, those guys, I think you could see earlier on in 2025. That's kind of where I think the Royals want to be as well. I don't think they want to rush a lot of these guys in a year in which they're not going to be truly contending. And that sucks to hear for some fans that maybe you have to sit through another sub 500 season, but you just got to know that at this point. You can't rush this process. If you really want this rebuild to work and for your draft prospects and the young guys on this team to flourish, to be ready to go, it's going to take a full year. And I think 2025 is a great target. There's going to be some guys like Javier Vaz making it up to the big leagues. Mason Barnett should be in the rotation next year. And in 2025, you're talking about maybe some of these guys that might have walked their way into a top 100 list. And I think if the Royals take their time, like they did with the Vinny Pasquantino, like they did with the Whit Merrifield, you can add some pieces that can slowly build your way to a competitive postseason bound team. I think it's a great question, Lando. And some of these guys, they're not going to make it. That's the reality of the minor leagues. That's the reality of drafting young guys. Some are never going to make it. But I think you're hoping of some of the top picks you made in 2023 and some of the top picks you make in 2024, you can have that target date of 2025 early on in 2025. But as I've said many times before, it's just a crapshoot. You never really know. I thought Asa Lacy would be up in Kansas City as early as 2022. We haven't seen him higher than Double A just yet. You just never really know with guys like this. You can't always predict what a prospect is going to be. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about is an American League divisional series that is on the brink of putting away the number one seed in the postseason. I'm going to tell you what that means for all of baseball coming up next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned in to Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. You can follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. The last thing I wanted to dive into today is a more so of a grand scheme type of look at this postseason, kind of taking a step back and observing everything. And I can't tell you that I've gathered much from the Phillies and Braves series so far. That just seems so different than what we see in Kansas City. Those are just two powerhouses going toe-to-toe right now. I just can't compare the Royals to anything with the Braves and the Phillies. I can't really compare them to much other than Arizona, really, on the National League side. Can't compare them to the Dodgers. And so far, Arizona's been kind of that sleeper team, that 2014 Royals feel, which I continue to root for a team like that. But I can't really compare the Royals to many teams on the National League side. The American League side, I can't really compare them to Houston. Minnesota slightly, just because they're in the division and, the Twins won 80-something games this year. It wasn't anything that impressive, but they're playing with house money right now. But my goal today is not really to compare a Royals team to somebody. It's more so to tell you how hard this sport is. And also a slight tip of the cap to the 14 and 15 Royals. I watched a little bit of postseason baseball today, the Orioles and Rangers series, in the middle of some NFL football, of course. The Chiefs played at 3 o'clock, so did the Orioles and the Rangers. And here are the Orioles, a team that defied the odds all year long, a division that was supposed to be much better than them. The Yankees have MVP players, $100 million payroll, multiple hundreds of $1 million payroll. Boston spent a lot of money. The Blue Jays got some heavy hitters. Just the Rays, a team that were, yes, in the COVID year, but in the World Series not long ago, a 90-plus team, a given 90-plus win team. And they started, 14-0, 15-0, 16-0, something like that. It was ridiculous. But Baltimore was the one that broke through everything. They defied the odds, and they won 100-plus games. And there really wasn't anything negative said about Baltimore all year long. How could you? They were a team that lost 110 2 years ago. They've got a loaded system. They've got the number one prospect in baseball. They get Ryan O'Hearn, who was DFA'd by Kansas City. Now he's one of their best bats off the bench. Anthony Santander, it's in the ugly years. You have young guys like Gunnar Henderson, Adley Rutschman. Austin Hayes had seen some ugly times. Your rotation, you kind of built, Grayson Rodriguez, you had Bradish, you have a bullpen with Felix Bautista, Yenier Cano. You couldn't say anything negative. And what's crazy to me, everything they've done all season long, defied the odds, looked like the team of destiny. You have Camden packed again. It's loud going into this weekend. It was you wanted to watch those games because you wanted to see that place in full effect. And it's been in full effect for quite some time. That place was rocking and sold out for the last 2 months. And such a magical season, right? Everything they had done in the offseason with their development, it looked to be right. It looked to be the perfect season. Now, they had some injuries. They didn't have John Means for the whole year. Felix Bautista's out. So you went through injuries. That happens when you play 162 games. What baffles me all the time in baseball is they don't reward good stories. They don't always. I shouldn't say they never do. They don't always. Sometimes they reward good stories. Take a look at the 14 and 15 Royals. But the Orioles, I would say on the American League side, did everything right in the rebuild. Right? Everything right. And yet, they're on the brink of elimination. They're going to have to win 3 straight against a team who, let's just call it as it is. They cut corners in their rebuild, and it worked out for them. Texas lost 94 games last year, and they lost a lot of games the year before that. And former Royal Chris Young just said, let's throw a bunch of money at guys. And they signed an entire rotation. They built a lineup with some development, some trades, and money. And here they are, a Rangers team that eliminated the Rays, and now we're going to eliminate America's sweetheart. At least it feels that way. They won 2 in Baltimore, and I would say 1 comfortably today. I know the Orioles had a prayer at the end. Aaron Hicks had the 3-run home run, but they were down by 6 runs going into the 9th. Baltimore couldn't win game 1, and you leave Camden without giving those fans a taste of a postseason victory. Now you got to win 2 in Texas and come back and win a game 5 thriller. It's crazy in baseball that everything can go right for you, right? It was, you look at the Royals and the Orioles rebuild, it's like, man, I would do anything to be in the Orioles' shoes, and I still would. Don't get me wrong. If the Royals won 100 games or were down 0-2 in a series, I'd still be like, they won 100 games and they're set up for a decade run of dominance. And they're ahead of schedule. And sometimes when you're ahead of schedule, you get roughed up by a team that has players who have been to the postseason before. But it goes to show you in baseball how hard this thing is. It is not as easy as the Royals made it look in 14 and 15. This is a really good Baltimore team. It's also a really good Texas team. And it was a really good Rays team. You know, the Braves were the scariest team in baseball this year. The Phillies go in and shut them out in Atlanta in game 1. The postseason is hard. It also, as much as it pains me to say it, it shows how impressive Houston's run has been. Yes, I know you have the cheating scandal in, 17? But they've also won a few more times. You know, this is a team that knows how to win in the postseason. And right now, when I'm watching postseason ball, I think you can see it a lot with teams that have that experience and teams that don't. And how even if you have a great season, I'm kind of under the impression of if you win that many games, you win your division, you can never take it for granted. If the Royals would have lost in game 4 in Houston, that season would have been a wash. You won 95 games only to lose in the first round of the playoffs to a young, spunky Astros team. But they washed it away and went on to win the World Series. I don't think 14 was a wash because kind of like the Orioles this year, the Royals got back into the postseason. They had a long drought, and they made up for lost time. They got to game 7 of the World Series. They were 90 feet away from tying that game. It's not a wash of a season. If Baltimore goes and loses to Texas in Arlington and gets swept, that feels like, even for a team that's that ahead of schedule, a miss on a 100-win season. Think about how rare 100-win seasons are. And winning in that division, the Yankees are going to be back. Boston's going to be back. Toronto, the Rays, those teams are going to spend money to beat you. You know, the Yankees got hurt this year. Boston got hurt. Tampa got hurt. Toronto, I just don't think could keep up at the very end. But Baltimore is kind of being exposed for never really having a great rotation this year. Not a lot of consistency. But it does kind of feel like a bittersweet moment for Baltimore. I mean, years of futility. I mean, you went from being the embarrassment of Major League Baseball, and I'm saying this coming from a Royals fan, and where you're at right now. But Baltimore going from 110 losses, I mean, 3 years and like a 5-year stretch of losing 100 plus, and then you win 100. I mean, that's a crazy turnaround. But then not to do anything in the postseason, that would sting a lot. You still be proud of what the team accomplished. I mean, that's no small feat. But, man, I thought Baltimore was going to put up much more of a fight than this. And they still can. There is still time, and they can come back and win this damn thing. But I'm just saying, what I saw today, it goes to show you how incredibly difficult baseball is. And what you do in the regular season once you get to October really doesn't matter. It doesn't. It does for seeding, who gets the home games first. But we saw Texas limp into the postseason. They haven't lost yet. They are a perfect 4-0, and all of those games have been on the road. Their first postseason game is game 5. And they can eliminate the 100-win Baltimore Orioles Baseball is crazy. It's difficult, and we will see who emerges out of the American League side. Well, that's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson. You can always follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. But until tomorrow, you take it easy, Kansas City.